Yet they are everywhere you look. Supernatural beings in a land of sweeping contrasts. Join us for a ghostly journey. From the hills and rivers of the Hudson Valley, to the treasures of New York City, to the haunted shipyards of Buffalo. You'll come face to face with lost spirits trying to find their way in haunted New York. New York. The very name evokes images etched into America's psyche. But behind these popular icons lies a colorful history, filled with battles, the meshing of cultures, powerful tycoons, and all too often, ghosts. Supernatural visitors who've been part of the fabric of New York for centuries. Both New York Harbor and the Hudson River were ports of entry for the first European settlers. The Dutch, French, and English brought legends and superstitions that would become the bedrock for the folklore of America.
There was a convergence of cultures in New York City, the Native American cultures and their beliefs in the supernatural. Along came the Dutch, the English, who brought their cultures. Now, the European culture of ghosts, you know, the very word ghost comes from Geist, German. Poltergeist, noisy ghost.
The belief in the supernatural was so powerful that by the turn of the 20th century, New York City became known as the most haunted city in America. That label still holds true today, and is nowhere more apparent than in this small home where the spirit of a lonely woman still resides.
Gertrude's caught in a time warp, in a sense. She created her own reality while she was in the living flesh. And she went to her death with unfulfilled passion. And as long as she stays here, there is hope. The passion may be fulfilled.
I don't know if elegance is an identity. I don't know if purity, originality, if those are the kinds of words that can describe a house. It definitely has its own aura, and people experiencing things within the house.
The Merchant's House is one of the true miracles of Manhattan and one of its most secretive. An eerie, beautiful, and some believe quite haunted portal into the 19th century. While most visitors feel the living history present in this 5-story brownstone, others have been touched, quite literally, by the restless spirit of the house. Most believe it is that of Miss Gertrude Treadwell, born in this bed in 1860 and dying some 93 years later in the same bed.
When the Treadwells moved into this house in 1835, there was no water system in New York. There were no bathrooms. There was, of course, no electrical light, and heating, no central heating whatsoever.
Gertrude's father, Seabury Treadwell, was a man used to getting his way with his employees and family. A successful merchant and strict Anglican, Seabury dominated his family with an iron will. When Gertrude, the 8th and youngest child, was born in 1840, her father was 60 years old, a chasm too wide for either to cross. Growing up in the Treadwell home was never easy. At least one brother had a major falling out with Seabury, and things were not much better for the other children. But through it all, Gertrude was determined to be happy. Although the details are lost to time, it's certain that Gertrude fell in love with a medical student named Lewis Walton. After months of quiet courtship, young Walton decided to ask old Seabury for his daughter's hand in marriage.
Well, I can only imagine that the young gentleman was terrified. Obviously, Gertrude and he had talked about the family, about her father and his personality and his formality and his conservative nature. This young man must have been somewhat nervous.
Being Catholic and struggling through medical school, Lewis didn't stand a chance with a status-conscious Treadwell. Whatever words old Seabury hurled at young Lewis must have found their mark in the heart of Gertrude. Some believe she made a decision that day that would last the rest of her long life. If not Lewis, there would be no one.
When Seabury Treadwell sent Lewis Walton away, Gertrude was in her early 20s, we think. And from that time on, she stayed in this house with the remaining members of the family. There were 3 other unmarried sisters that stayed with her and died. There were a lot of deaths, a lot of funerals in this house. And Gertrude simply stayed and kept the house exactly as Papa would have wanted it, is what family legend says.
In 1909, Julia, Gertrude's last remaining sister, died. Now only Gertrude remained, refusing to let even the new light of electricity illuminate her darkened world.
As Gertrude got older and more impoverished, she took in boarders, and it has been said that the windows were shuttered and that she very, very, very rarely went out, if at all.
Some might say hers was a lonely death. It would seem obvious, but who really knows what went through Gertrude's mind in those final moments of a life never really lived? Was it regret, anger, or relief? Perhaps to her, physical death was no different than the life she just left behind. Whatever the case, Gertrude Treadwell, age 93, died on August 22, 1933. Her whole universe encapsulated within the walls of 29 East 4th Street, New York City.
Fortuitously, a distant relative, a man named George Chapman, got wind of the fact that the house was going into foreclosure, the possessions were going to be sold at auction. He came, he saw the house, and he turned it into a museum 3 years later.
Almost immediately, odd things became frighteningly apparent.
People have heard sighing, moaning sounds coming from the bedroom, from a closet. They've heard the faint echoing sound of a piano being played. Seen what they believe to be the figure of Gertrude Treadwell getting dressed or just gliding across the floor or gliding down a staircase.
Could the spirit of Gertrude Treadwell be trapped within the confines of her earthly home even after death? If so, how must she feel about the intruders now occupying her house?
In the early 90s, the curator here at the museum was on the computer quite a lot. And whenever she would type in the name Treadwell or Gertrude or any family name, the computer would freeze.
TV producer Tracy Abbott visited the merchant's house in 1987. At the time, she had no idea it was haunted.
During our tour, no one ever mentioned a haunting. I knew the story of Gertrude, and I knew that there was a situation where she had fallen in love with someone and her father didn't approve. And it never occurred to me to say, is it haunted?
When Tracy's photos were developed, she saw something unusual in one of them. A picture shot in a bedroom next to Gertrude's deathbed. 3 years passed before Tracy read about the sightings of Gertrude in that very same room.
I felt the hair on my back just kind of go up, because I thought, I think that's where I took my picture.
Tracy's hasn't been the only unusual photo taken in the room. Other ghostly manifestations, such as cold spots and sounds, are common. Could Gertrude be keeping close watch on her eternal home?
When I lock up at night and I close the shutters and I turn off the lights, when I lock up at night and I close the shutters and I turn off the lights, we say goodnight to each other. And I think that maybe she comes around a bit more. And I close the door at night and it's her house again.
Does the spirit of Gertrude Treadwell still wander these quiet rooms? Perhaps only memories of what could have been keep her here. But more than one passerby has heard the soft sounds of a piano within, playing a melody of a love lost long ago. Far north, away from the lights of Manhattan, we asked the question, did one of World War II's most tragic events spur a spirit's eternal search?
We now return to Haunted History.
All All is quiet now. The roar of battle a distant echo. The men who lived within this steel shell a faded memory. Yet something watches. Something searches.
When I'm alone on this ship, I hum tunes, you know, because I feel something. It's like someone's watching you, presence. It's really haunting.
It was like a thick, heavy presence. It was almost like a heavy sorrow, is the best I can describe it. There's definitely something here.
That spirit that walks through that ship today seems to be seeking something that it probably will never find.
Not far from the roar of Niagara Falls in northwestern New York is Buffalo and Erie County Naval Park. It is the final resting place of a brave ship that has heard its own thunder, the thunder of war. She is the USS The Sullivans, named for 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa: Joe, Frank, Albert, Madison, and their big brother George.
They were very close, all 5 brothers, and so they were together the whole time. And everything they did in 5s. Of course, there was one incident there where there was almost 4. They went out on a boat made of very flimsy material and toppled over, and they barely managed to survive. And after that, incidentally, they felt that if they could survive that, they could survive anything in the future, as long as they stuck together.
After Pearl Harbor, the brothers felt compelled to act. They came to a unanimous decision.
They insisted that they stay together in the same ship. And when they were told that it's impossible because it's against Navy policy, they said, well, in that case, they would not volunteer. That was, of course, a rather historical moment in a sense, because up to then, the Navy wouldn't permit people from the same family to join a particular ship or a particular unit of any kind, for fear that more than one might die, you know, at the same time.
The Navy relented, and the 5 brothers wound up serving together on a new destroyer, the USS Juno.
It could go 32 knots, which is very fast. But in order to do this, it had to have a thin skin, so to speak, which could easily be pierced by any torpedo.
After months at sea, the Juno was nearing Guadalcanal. It was November 1942, Friday the 13th. During the night, the ship was involved in the bloody battle with the Japanese attack force. She suffered a crippling but survivable hit. 19 men were killed.
The Juno was able to continue on, and it managed to float away from the battle itself. And it was then that a Japanese submarine hit it.
4 of the Sullivan brothers perished. The eldest, George, was seriously injured and in shock. He did what he'd always done, worried about his 4 brothers and his vow to protect them, a promise now impossible to keep.
Out of approximately 700 crew members, 140 managed somehow to survive and get into the water alive.
George got to a raft, unable to accept what fate had wrought.
He just went crazy looking for his other brothers. He started screaming the names of his brother just about all the time, day after day. He went from one raft to the other continually, and he would wipe off the black from these various faces to make sure that they were not really his brothers.
Compounding the horror, the survivors had another foe.
The sharks came, and they started, pulling men who were hanging onto the raft.
Despite American planes overhead and a fleet within miles of the tragedy, no rescuers arrived. In what would become one of the darkest episodes in naval history, the decision was made to maintain radio silence and not report the sinking of the Juno.
I think it's one of the great tragedies and great scandals, really, of World War II.
For 8 days, the survivors dotted the surface. One can only imagine the torture George Sullivan was enduring. On the 8th day, his mind finally snapped.
The sun was just broiling, and it just ate the skin right off his body. And finally, he really went mad, and he decided that he was going to jump into the water and swim to an island, which was actually about 50 miles away. and he hadn't gone very far when a shark got him, and that was the last that was seen of George.
Of almost 700 men, only 10 survived. The death of the Sullivan brothers became a patriotic rallying cry. On April 4th, 1943, the destroyer, the USS The Sullivans, was christened by Alita Sullivan, the boy's mother.
President Roosevelt had the ship named in memory of the 5 Sullivan brothers, and it was the first ship of the fleet ever to bear "the" in the name.
The ship served proudly for the next 22 years, fighting missions in World War II and Korea, and taking part in the blockade during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Despite its long history in the face of war, there were no fatalities aboard ship. It wasn't until her decommissioning in 1965 that the public began hearing stories of ghostly events on the Sullivans.
In 1969, 4 years later, the first public report of a ghostly sighting on the Sullivans came to light. The report of a 12-year veteran of the Navy seeing a wrench going flying past him and hitting a bulkhead.
It didn't end there. In 1977, the ship found its home in Buffalo, where to this day, workers and visitors report strange, unexplainable occurrences.
People have come to me with photographs of the pictures that we have of the 5 Sullivan brothers. And in these, the 4 brothers come out clear. The picture of George, you cannot distinguish his features. All you see is a big blur of light.
Eddie Kirkwood started working here 13 years ago. For him, the haunting isn't a possibility. It's a daily fact.
When we found the locks and the hatches undone, we assumed that it might have been former staff with keys, so we changed all the locks. And then I come back over the next day and things are open. Those same new locks are now open. So it's really unexplainable.
Eddie's encounters with whatever occupies the ship have more than once interfered with his duties.
We had just got finished locking up our other 2 vessels, and I was told to stay late and paint the yellow line. And it was a hot, humid day, and this paint can just whipped right across my face, and I was in amaze. I looked around me. There was no one in sight. All I felt was the whip of the can.
Are spirits trying to communicate with the living?
But one night after a party, I had just locked this vessel up, and I look over, and the radar is spinning around. I had just shut the power off. I couldn't see how it possibly could have been going around, because once I hit the main circuit breaker, that's it.
It was about 7:30 in the evening, and I had locked up the other ships, and the Sullivans was the last ship I was going to secure for the day. And as I'm walking parallel with the ship, I had this strange feeling like something was there, but I just couldn't see it. And it was a weird kind of energy I've never experienced before in my life, or have I ever experienced since. And as I'm getting on the gangway, the handles start rattling back and forth simultaneously. And I stepped back. I was pretty spooked about the whole situation. I went on the ship to lock up. Whatever it was right beside me the whole way. It was like standing right there, and I could feel it. And I heard someone talking in the aft head. So I had gone in there and had said that the park was closed. There was nobody in there. And there was a Pepsi can that came flying out of the corner and hit the bulkhead right in front of me. And I did just about everything. I was tripping over myself to get out of that compartment.
Eddie Kirkwood recalls a frightening experience that occurred to another worker.
He went down to check the fire extinguishers one morning and check the lockers, you know, because we open up for tourists every morning. And I had heard he was on the main deck crying. He had saw a bloody face down below, and he just came out in tears.
Most feel the spirit aboard the ship is restless and spends its night searching for someone or something. Is this the tortured spirit of George Sullivan returning to find those he vowed to protect?
The ship has tremendous memories. It is a memorial to the Sullivan brothers. It is a memorial to the family. When people come through and they understand the story, it does evoke emotions from them.
George kept crying out the names of his brothers day after day, hour after hour. I think it was almost, symbolic of the cries that perhaps you could even hear today. Perhaps other people in the future will also hear those voices because they were almost universal. They were crying out for people he loved, people he honored, and his voice may be heard forever.
The USS The Sullivans isn't the only place where the voices of the past are still heard. 4 hours away stands a centuries-old castle, now a restaurant, where the spirits you encounter aren't necessarily those you order from the menu.
We now return to haunted history.
When I walked into the castle, there were so many different kinds of energies around that it was mind-boggling. And my first thought was to turn around and leave because I didn't want to be in the energy.
The picturesque Mohawk Valley between Buffalo and Albany was once a major pathway to westward expansion.
The Mohawk Valley has a natural waterway to the west, and it was the only natural waterway across the Appalachian Mountains. It was used by the Indians previous to the white man coming, and it became the way west, the most popular way.
For 50 years, many a weary traveler has stopped at Beardsley Castle, a restaurant known for its fine food and ambiance. But for others, it might as well be called Ghost Central.
Everybody that worked here really did believe, you know, and we didn't take it lightly. We took it very seriously that there were ghosts here.
There's a male that likes the dungeon in the area of the bar downstairs, and there's a female that's in the main dining room and goes up to the banquet room.
The history of Beardsley Castle extends well before its life as a restaurant, to a time when Native Americans considered the nearby waterfalls a sacred place. In the 1780s, an engineer named John Beardsley built a magnificent home in the Mohawk Valley. Some believe the forces that inhabit the castle may be traced to John's grandson, Guy.
He was educated here. He spent a year in France. He went to West Point, graduated from West Point, and spent 2 years in North Dakota fighting the Sioux.
He was approached by some engineers out of New York City in the 1890s with the possibility of developing electric power along East Creek. So he went ahead and it became the first rural electrification in the country.
Guy spent years fighting the Sioux and apparently began collecting Indian artifacts, among them sacred war bonnets. Many today feel taking sacred objects was an invitation to trouble.
We wouldn't play around with someone's casket. We wouldn't bring it into the home and put it up saying, gee, isn't this pretty? We honor those things. There's a sanctity about them.
Whether one believes in the notion of karma, consider this. All of Guy Beardsley's personal belongings, including his beloved artifacts, were destroyed in a mysterious fire in 1919. After Guy Beardsley's death in 1937, nothing was done with the castle until the 40s, when it was sold to a Danish couple, the Christiansens. They opened it as a restaurant, and another legend of Beardsley Castle was created.
In the mid-50s, it was apparent that Pop became fairly ill. Eventually, he did hang himself right here in the building.
Not coincidentally, it was about that time the earliest hauntings began.
There's a lot of events that are related to table settings, glassware, those types of things.
Other stories circulated, stories of mysterious sounds, water turning off and on, and the shadow of a man. By the 1980s, the hauntings came to a fevered pitch. In one infamous incident, employees were playing with a Ouija board when it spelled out the word, leave. Almost immediately, one man felt physically assaulted.
He said he was hit in the chest by a sudden force, and they certainly didn't stay very long after that.
Did the Ouija board unleash something better left undisturbed? Even if that was true, what could account for the terrifying attack on hostess Sherry Fox and her friends in January 1987?
I said, okay, I'm all done and we're ready to leave. And all three of us walked in the back room to shut the lights off. And we got back there and I said, there's somebody in there. And they said, okay. And we turned around and we left. To my recollection, when we got right about here, we heard this noise that I can't explain to you. It was No human being could project this out of their voice. It was this noise that sounded like a growl and a scream, but it was so loud. And it was after us. It was behind us. And we took off and we ran as fast as we could through there and up the stairs.
Unexplained incidents are not limited to the castle itself.
Between the 1950s and the 1970s, I would say there was probably 6 or 7 car accidents that happened on the curve or near the curve west of here.
Some eyewitnesses say they ran off the road trying to avoid either a young boy or girl carrying a lantern.
One of the difficulties about ascertaining whether it's a girl or a boy, John Beardsley had a child who died at 7 years old, and the Beardsleys had named the child Pardee, and we can't tell whether that's a boy or a girl.
When Randall Brown purchased the castle in 1992, it was a shell of its former self, abandoned and gutted by another fire in 1989. He decided to rebuild and immediately noticed that something was not quite right at Beardsley Castle.
When we first looked at the property, we had heard that there'd been a fire, and we came in, and what impressed us as potential was that all the original woodwork, all the original part of the building was intact. And it seemed, in a way, like whatever might have been here, if something did cause the fire, like they didn't want a restaurant here, or they didn't want the restaurant here that was here before.
Randall and his partner spent over a year restoring the castle. They reopened in February of 1994 with a special precaution.
We had a local reverend come in and bless the building. We've had a number of people who are waiters or waitresses or had worked here before who have come back to the restaurant and said that it feels a little more calm here, a little more at peace.
Have things quieted down at Beardsley? Just ask Dave, the bartender.
It doesn't even matter if we're busy or not busy. There are times that suddenly you're going to reach for something, and something will fall and break. It could be 2 or 3 over, but as you're going ahead and you're grabbing something, at that moment, it's almost as if what's ever down here is kind of just playing a little joke, and I like to get people's attention.
Psychic Kathleen Bittner-Roth believes several entities occupy different areas at Beardsley with decidedly different reasons for being there.
The forces that are at Beardsley that are of the Native American spirit are to remain there for eternity. That energy was there in place long before Mr. Beardsley built the castle, and it needs to remain, and it will remain. Randall Brown had Beardsley Castle sanctified before he moved in. What this did was put things to sleep, so to speak. And what appears to be pranks are really sort of putting you on notice.
Are there angry spirits within the thick stone walls of Beardsley Castle? Or are these just stories to while away the cold, frozen winters while imbibing alcoholic spirits in the bar downstairs? Perhaps one needs to see to believe. This photograph was taken by an employee. Could it show the force that occupies the basement of the castle?
Each person has to weigh for themselves whether they believe in ghosts first, and then do they believe that there is a ghost here. There's something here. I don't know what. I don't know if it's good or it's bad. There certainly is a history here, if nothing else.
History may also be alive on the far tip of Staten Island, where in a centuries-old house, a young boy has befriended a hostile spirit from the 1700s.
We now return to haunted history.
The Billop House, in terms of hauntings, in terms of numbers of things happening, was having maybe 3 or 4 occurrences a week.
The Billop House is one of Staten Island's oldest and most historic homes. Built in 1680, it stands as a proud reminder of the tumultuous days when America was fighting for her independence. Days when bullets were flying, heroes were being born, and passions were at a feverish pitch. Perhaps that is why the Billop House is regarded today as one of New York's most haunted locales. The stories reported in the Billop House range widely, from a young child who wakes in the middle of the night to speak to a ghostly friend.
He sat with me and he said, "Mommy, does the soldier ever come and see you at night?"
To a female specter seen signaling futilely to companions long dead.
I feel her presence is a coldness that makes me feel is coming around me and through me.
Much of it is certainly related to events that have taken place in the past. Historical events, emotional events that have taken place in the past.
The story of the Billop House and its reported spirits is steeped in the fabric of history. But no one event looms larger than that of the ill-fated Staten Island Peace Conference of 1776. By this time, the Revolutionary War was well underway. The British and Americans had been trading volleys for more than a year. But there was hope among the Loyalists there could be a reconciliation before more blood was spilled. To this end, a peace commission was formed.
The terms of the commission were pardons for the Americans. No independence, sign an oath of allegiance to the King of England, and there will be widespread pardons.
With the likes of Ben Franklin and John Adams in attendance, there were high hopes. But as it turned out, the peace conference wasn't much of one at all. The Americans had just signed the Declaration of Independence, and it soon became clear that the conference could not stem the tide of history. As the war progressed, Staten Island remained firmly under British control. The Billop House now became home to legions of British and Hessian soldiers. Its owner, Christopher Billop, was a tough-minded English colonel with a fiery temper.
Colonel Christopher Billop was one of the leading politicians on Staten Island prior to the war, and of course during the war. He was a member of the General Assembly and was a very class-conscious person, and could be irritated quite easily if provoked, especially if provoked by someone who he felt was class inferior.
During the war, Billop was twice abducted by Americans who held him in trade for American prisoners. He became convinced there was a spy living under his roof.
The story is that the Americans on the Jersey Shore were notified by a servant girl that lived in the house by lighting a candle in the window as a signal that the Tory colonel was home.
As the story goes, Billop caught the girl in the act of signaling to waiting patriots across the bay, and in a fit of rage, murdered her. Christopher Billop left the country after the war and never set foot in the U.S. again. Over the years, the Billop House changed hands a number of times, even once serving as a rat poison factory. By 1895, it was abandoned by its owner and left to ruin.
Then in the 1920s, the Conference House Association was created in order to save and preserve the history of the house and save the architecture of the house.
In 1937, the work was done, the house was open to the public, and reports of unexplainable occurrences haven't stopped since.
I've read stories associated with this house that date back to after the Revolution, when people said things were happening in the house.
The most recent reports come from caretakers living on the property. In the 1970s, Vincent and Maureen Malone lived at the Billop House with their young son, Justin.
When we moved in, we weren't moving in looking for any of these things to happen. As they occurred, we just accepted them and kind of rolled with what was ever happening.
This was something that would happen often. You would go to turn out a light, and before you would actually get to the switch, go out. I thought that was very strange.
The Malones encountered even stranger phenomena, a plant swinging of its own accord, flashing lights, and strange sounds at night.
I would take a nap on the sofa in the living room, kick off my shoes, lay down, doze off, but I would get up and start moving my feet around where I knew my shoes were, and the shoes would be gone. The first time that happened, I thought, well, maybe I left them upstairs. Even though I was sure they were by the sofa, I questioned myself. Went upstairs, the shoes, sure enough, were upstairs, but this would happen constantly.
While most of the events are benign, one incident wasn't.
There was one time that I was actually frightened at the house. I had gone into the museum for something or other. It was dark, there was no electricity, and turned to come back into our living quarters. And right at the doorway, there was sort of a coolness, not really a breeze, just slightly cool. and it felt as if a hand had gone through my hair. It was very frightening. I felt very cold, and I felt a little scared. I felt somehow violated.
What could have touched Maureen Malone? Was it Christopher Billop or someone else? Al Rauber, a parapsychologist, was called in. He recalls a chilling story concerning the Malones' young son, Justin.
He was only 4 or 5 years old at the time. He couldn't reach the sink to get a glass of water. And I remember one day, he used to always talk to this imaginary friend of his that he used to call RB. Well, one day Maureen went into his room and saw a glass of water sitting on the dresser. And she said, "Where did you get that glass of water from?" And her son said, "Well, my friend Armby gave it to me." And at that point in time, a 5-year-old child described a British Revolutionary War soldier from his hat to his boots, complete.
And he also told us that his soldier was killed on the grounds. And that kind of detail was... And he also told us that his soldier was killed on the grounds. And that kind of detail was a little frightening.
Parapsychologist Al Rauber thinks there are several ghostly personalities in the home.
I would say that Billop is probably associated with a lot of the activity that's taken place in the downstairs section of the house.
But is the spirit of Billop's murder victim also living in the house?
Many people have seen an actual physical manifestation of the girl. They've seen her upstairs again in the hallway just outside of the Franklin room.
Yet despite this unlikely haunting by tormentor and victim, most who work at the Billop house seem to feel a comfort emanating from the ancient home. 2 hours from the Billop house, deep in the Hudson Valley, the spirit of a girl named Lavender is said to walk along these lonely roads. Is it truth or just a legend?
We now return to Haunted History.
Napoleon once said, history is the version of past events that people have agreed on. This certainly holds true in the ghost stories of New York, where the line between history and legend is often blurred. In the Hudson Valley region of Ramapo, history and legend blend in what is one of the country's most famous ghost stories.
What makes the Lavender story truly unique is the locales, the details of the story.
There's enough elements in this story that ring true for us in the area that we believe it. We believe it.
Chuck Stead has lived in the valley his entire life. He is one of the region's foremost storytellers. Among the legends he is asked about most is a ghostly tale that has come to be known as an urban legend, the story of Lavender.
Probably my Uncle Mal is more responsible for the way I tell this story, because I really tell it the way he told it to me that day in the Ramapo Cemetery when I first heard it from him.
You can find folklore stories that could fit anywhere, but the Lavender story we know here can only come from the Ramapos.
2 boys from the Tuxedo High School, Jackie and Jimmy, and they're going to the prom. But you know, there's not enough girls to go around that year, so they're going what you call stag. It's a special night, so they're going to borrow a car. Jimmy, in fact, didn't have a proper jacket to wear to the prom, so he, in fact, borrowed a jacket. So they both borrowed some. And they drive up on this cool summer night, uncomfortably cool for June. And they drive up toward Tuxedo High School. And as they're driving, Jimmy is glum. He's not in the mood. And Jackie's having a good time. He's driving the car and he's feeling mighty cool. And as they drive up Lake Road toward the hamlet, they both spot a girl standing by the side of the road. And Jimmy says, "Look at that girl up there." And Jackie says, "Yeah, look at that girl up there." Jimmy says, let's pull over. Let's see what she wants. And he coaxes him to pull over. And Jimmy says, "Where you going?" And she tells him she's going to a dance. And he says, "We are too," and he gets her in the car. And it's close quarters in front of this little car, so she kind of snuggled in between them. Jimmy more or less got his arm around her when she did so, and that's when he felt the chill for the first time. She was very cold. And as they're going up the road, he says, "I'm Jimmy, what's your name?" And she says, "Lavender." And of course, that was the color of the dress she was wearing. So they get to the Tuxedo High School, and Jackie darts right in, gets ahead of him, goes up to the counter with the other fellas. He says, wait till you see who's coming in with Jimmy. You won't believe what we picked up. Well, when he comes in with the girl, the music had just started up again. And she turns to him. She takes him into her arms, and they start to dance. And they were quite the sight. And Jackie, he was shocked because, you see, he remembered Jimmy couldn't dance. And now he can dance. And boy, did he dance all night long, a couple hours there at the dance. He didn't take a break. Along around maybe midnight, it's time to go. Jackie just did not have a good time that night. It wasn't the prom he planned on, and he marches out to the car and he says, come on, kids. And he climbs in the car, and the two of them follow him out. They get into the car, and as they're going down the road, Lavender is chill, a real deep chill. That's when Jimmy takes his jacket off himself, and he puts it around her shoulders, and he holds her tight. But oh, is she cold, much colder than before. And they get down around the Black Bridge, and Jackie says, all right, I'll go across the bridge, tell me where you live. And she says, no, leave me off here. And he says, all right, stop the car. She gets out, and Jimmy, he just wanted to say something like, I had a fine time, I'd like to see you again. But when he turned to her and looked into her eyes, and when she kissed him on the cheek, completely forgot what he was going to say. And they went down the road, leaving the girl right there by the Black Bridge. Well, Jackie said, you are a fool. You let her walk off with your jacket. You borrowed that jacket. And Jimmy says, well, we'll go back tomorrow and we'll find it. And they returned the next day, and they drove across the Black Bridge into the hamlet. This was the first time these boys had ever been in the hamlet. And there was a little row of houses, old working-class houses. And Jimmy got out of the car, and he went to the door, and he knocked on a door, and somebody came, and he started to describe Lavender, mentioned her name, and the woman took her head and closed the door. And as he continued along the road, asking people, they didn't talk to him much at all. If they said anything, it was just, I'm sorry, son. They pulled up to the last house, and an old woman came to the door. And he asked if she knew about this girl that he'd seen the night before, this girl Lavender. And she said she had. This girl was her daughter. Well, might have been her granddaughter, maybe her great-granddaughter, but it really couldn't have been her daughter. The woman was too old. And she said, no, she's my daughter, she said. She's my daughter, and she loved that color so much, she had me make her that dress, and then wouldn't even wear a shawl when she went out that night to wait for the ride to the dance. They say she was practicing her steps by the Black Bridge when a truck come down and hit her. Killed her, they say, right away. Jimmy heard enough, he wanted to leave, but Jackie now, he was interested. He said, ma'am, can you prove this? She said, sure I can. Go down to Ramapo Cemetery, you'll find where they buried her. Jackie pulled the car into the Ramapo Cemetery. And Jimmy said, what are you doing? And Jackie says, we're trying to find the end of the story. Well, they did not have far to look, because she was buried right there at the tombstone where they found Jimmy's jacket hanging over the stone, waiting for him.
When I first heard the Lavender story, it was told to me by someone who really did believe it. There are people who still believe that this happened, still believe that they knew someone who was involved in some way with the story.
There's so many vanishing hitchhiker stories. In 1980, I was down at a storytelling conference, and I found almost 32 other versions. But what makes this work for me as the genesis, as the truest version, is it's one of the oldest, and it's one of the most personal. With the three lead characters, Jackie, Jimmy, and Lavender, it has an interaction at the heart of the story that is, I think, very personable to our own sense of our adolescent years, of our time of coming of age. This one speaks to you personally. It speaks to your heart, speaks to your sense of romance, and to your sense of you, to who you are.
To many in Ramapo, Lavender is not a legend. From Lake Road to the Tuxedo High School, and finally, Ramapo Cemetery, folklorists agree this is more than just a story. This has the ring of truth. What then should we make of the ghostly tales that flow from the cities and villages of New York? Could all of these sightings be illusionary, the products of fertile and powerful imaginations? Or could New York be the eternal home for spirits doomed to wander these lands forever?
What makes someone notorious? inconceivable crimes.
The hair on the back of your neck stands up when you realize what you're watching.
And a passion for publicity.
He enjoyed the attention. He wanted to be on the front page.
Secret schemes and shocking extremes, 5 nights a week. Notorious, Monday through Friday at 8. Only on Bio. True story.
Bed in 1860 and dying some 93 years later in the same bed.
When the Treadwells moved into this house in 1835, there was no water system in New York. There were no bathrooms. There was, of course, no electrical light, and heating, no central heating whatsoever.
Gertrude's father, Seabury Treadwell, was a man used to getting his way with his employees and family. A successful merchant and strict Anglican, Seabury dominated his family with an iron will. When Gertrude, the 8th and youngest child, was born in 1840, her father was 60 years old, a chasm too wide for either to cross. Growing up in the Treadwell home was never easy. At least one brother had a major falling out with Seabury, and things were not much better for the other children. But through it all, Gertrude was determined to be happy. Although the details are lost to time, it's certain that Gertrude fell in love with a medical student named Lewis Walton. After months of quiet courtship, young Walton decided to ask old Seabury for his daughter's hand in marriage.
Well, I can only imagine that the young gentleman was terrified. Obviously, Gertrude and he had talked about the family, about her father and his personality and his formality and his conservative nature. This young man must have been somewhat nervous.
Being Catholic and struggling through medical school, Lewis didn't stand a chance with a status-conscious Treadwell. Whatever words old Seabury hurled at young Lewis must have found their mark in the heart of Gertrude. Some believe she made a decision that day that would last the rest of her long life. If not Lewis, there would be no one.
When Seabury Treadwell sent Lewis Walton away, Gertrude was in her early 20s, we think. And from that time on, she...
But behind these popular icons lies a colorful history, filled with battles, the meshing of cultures, powerful tycoons, and all too often, ghosts. Supernatural visitors who've been part of the fabric of New York for centuries. Both New York Harbor and the Hudson River were ports of entry for the first European settlers. The Dutch, French, and English brought legends and superstitions that would become the bedrock for the folklore of America.
There was a convergence of cultures in New York City, the Native American cultures and their beliefs in the supernatural. Along came the Dutch, the English, who brought their cultures. Now, the European culture of ghosts, you know, the very word ghost comes from Geist, German. Poltergeist, noisy ghost.
The belief in the supernatural was so powerful that by the turn of the 20th century, New York City became known as the most haunted city in America. That label still holds true today, and is nowhere more apparent than in this small home where the spirit of a lonely woman still resides.
Gertrude's caught in a time warp, in a sense. She created her own reality while she was in the living flesh. And she went to her death with unfulfilled passion. And as long as she stays here, there is hope. The passion may be fulfilled.
I don't know if elegance is an identity. I don't know if purity, originality, if those are the kinds of words that can describe a house. It definitely has its own aura, and people experiencing things within the house.
The Merchant's House is one of the true miracles of Manhattan and one of its most secretive. An eerie, beautiful, and some believe quite haunted portal into the 19th century. While most visitors feel the living history present in this 5-story brownstone, others have been touched, quite literally, by the restless spirit of the house. Most believe it is that of Miss Gertrude Treadwell, born in this... Yet they are everywhere you look. Supernatural beings in a land of sweeping contrasts. Join us for a ghostly journey. From the hills and rivers of the Hudson Valley, to the treasures of New York City, to the haunted shipyards of Buffalo. You'll come face to face with lost spirits trying to find their way in haunted New York. New York. The very name evokes images etched into America's